What's going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at what I would do if I were in charge of balancing Marvel Snap. That's right, it's Faux-TA time. As always, before we get started, your disclaimer that I am a contractor. These are my opinions only, and do not represent the thoughts of anyone at Second Dinner. With that said, I think that the major problem as I see it in the current Marvel Snap metagame is ubiquity. I don't necessarily think that Thanos Fractured Frontier is actually too strong. I think that he's too played, and that often comes at the detriment of other archetypes. Which is not to say even that I'm overly confident that I need to do this nerf, because I think Thanos Fractured Frontier is a powerful but ultimately relatively balanced card in the sense that he is very unable to fit meaningful interaction for combo decks, at least the breadth of combo decks that we have in Marvel Snap, into his shells, which relegates him to being only, and only is still notable here, the king of mid-range. But I don't necessarily love that. And I know that I've seen the developers mention that they're sensitive to ubiquity. So with that in mind, this patch is aimed not just at toning him down a little bit, but at making sure that other build-around cards are more rewarded. Because in as much as I have been able to spot a problem with Thanos, it's largely that he's a card that you build around in sort of generic, non-specific, non-identity based ways. And one of the things that I believe is that Marvel Snap is better when it has decks that have identity, where Thanos decks tend to be various forms of decent points, but there's not necessarily a cohesive whole there. So a lot of this patch is aimed at toning down what you might call mid-range slop and toning up cards and archetypes that have defined identities that are about those cards. So with that in mind, I really do think that Thanos is pretty close to an okay balanced card. Like, I wouldn't be shocked if they were like, this is totally fine, we don't need to nerf it at all. But for the purposes of what I'm doing here, I do think that he is an important piece of the things that are pushing other mid-range decks out. I also think that I could have aimed this nerf at like a Batroc or a Sam Wilson or any of the other cards that are just in like every mid-range deck running around, but Thanos is sort of the version of that right now, so I think he's mostly a numbers issue. I took 2 points off him. That's really all I did. I don't even know if I need to do that. Like, I think it's possible I went too far here, but I think you'll understand where I was going with this when you see the rest of what I'm proposing. And we're going to start with Weapon H, who I think is an exciting, interesting card for an archetype that hasn't really ever existed, which is discard big guys that aren't necessarily going to be Apocalypse. I think that both Apocalypse and Khonshu have pretty defined roles in the archetype, where this guy is just sort of an also-ran. And I think that making a discard archetype feel a little bit more impactful in terms of the things it's getting down, giving it a little bit of a better payoff, something that doesn't just sit on the board and get Cosmic Ghost Rider or blown up by Thanos Soulstone like Dracula does, I think could go a long way. I think that this is the kind of thing that they should be doing a little bit more of, is pushing on these archetypal things rather than these sort of generic mid-rangey Thanos type guys. My instinct is that this is one of like probably 5 archetypal buffs that I've done in this Faux-TA, and I think this is actually likely the weakest, because yes, it's a 2-point buff, but it's 2 points on a card that is already relatively large, so it's a smaller buff by percentage than, say, buffing a 5 power card by 1 power. That's actually a higher percentage and likely to be more impactful buff than what I'm doing to this. There was a while where I was considering 17 on this, but that seems like kind of egregious. I'm not really sure. My instinct is just that there's a lot of ceiling they could add to discard decks by just making them the archetype that's about big dumb idiots. And I don't really know why they haven't felt like that's an appropriate thing to do, because this card feels like a card that has basically never been all that good. The discard archetype is in a weird spot where it typically shows up pretty much exclusively when mid-range decks get too techy, and that tech does not affect discard. And this is getting rarer and rarer to actually happen, right? This is a deck that's fundamentally just doing point output. I would like to make it better at doing point output. And I think that this is a good place to put it, because it's putting it in a card that is not necessarily being run all of the time, and in a card that is very much third in the big guy discard spot. Making discard players actually have to make choices about what top end they run, I think would be kind of an interesting thing to do. Vulture's in a bit of a weird spot. As a one cost move payoff, I think they've been a little light on his payoff effectively. Because he's a one cost card, I think they feel pressure to keep his payoff down. I have decided that I think that's dumb. I think that what Vulture should be is a card that if you move him twice, he's one of the biggest dudes ever, because moves are a limited resource. That's the big thing that Vulture should be driving home. Moves are a limited resource, and Vulture, as the guy who gets the least payoff from moves, does not serve his role as a one-cost movable payoff because it doesn't work. And I think that that is a really important note. It's not good to use your limited resources of cards that make other cards move on a Vulture. You want to be using them on more expensive cards with better payoffs. And my method of trying to fix that is to make Vulture's payoff much more comparable to other move payoffs. So what I've done, 1, 2, but he gets +4 if you move him. So at 2 moves, he will be outdoing current Vulture by 1 point. At 3 moves, he will be outdoing current Vulture by 2. And that is, I think, not even necessarily enough to move the needle, which is why I feel like it's so safe to do this. I realize it's scary to put +4 on a card like this, but once you start thinking about this in terms of the context of how you play a move deck, which is I have a limited amount of moves per game. I have a Ghost Spider, I have a Madam Web, and I have a couple of other cards that are actually going to be able to move my cards. I need to save those for high impact moves. When you look at the move decks that are actually being played right now, the cards they're moving are enormously buffed Multiple Men and then also Human Torch. That makes sense because those are the cards that say, when I move, double me. That's what people are actually doing with move decks. Nobody's playing Dagger. Nobody's playing Vulture. Nobody's playing Dagger. It's not happening. And I don't even think that this is going to change that paradigm. I just think it's like obviously the correct thing to do as long as there are other move cards in the package that say double me. I find it hard to believe with a straight face that they could look at this change and say, oh yeah, that'd be too strong. I just don't think it would. If you've watched my last Faux-TA video, you probably remember this one because it's been sitting in my brain like a recurring nightmare or dream, depending on how you look at it, ever since I realized that this was something that made a ton of sense. I also added a power to her because Destroy is pretty abysmal. So with that said, X23 should be a 1-2, first of all, straight up. Second of all, I have also added an ability where she gains power when destroyed in addition to providing the energy. I think right now the experience of destroying X23 is actually not incredibly fun because the way the Destroy deck tends to play out, you're not actually using that energy a lot. It's cool when you're able to get a null into Zola because you blew up an X23, but I don't really think that destroying her a bunch is something that you're really wanting to do a lot of the time. And I think a lot of that is down to the fact that she's not gaining power when you do it. I think that Destroy as an archetype is an archetype that should be one of Marvel Snap's best for a variety of different reasons. First of which is that it is an archetype with an astonishing amount of identity. Very few other archetypes play like Destroy. If you want to feel the feelings that Destroy gives you, you kind of have to play it. And it has a ton of Marvel's most iconic and unique characters in it. Beyond that, I think a metagame that is balanced around Destroy is a metagame that has many options to solve the problem. There are many tech cards that are good into Destroy, and that means that if it's ever the best deck, it won't be for long because you can target it with other archetypes. This, I feel, is a safe way to choose a sort of deck that you're happy to have near the top of the metagame. And for me, that's what Destroy is. So I'm attempting to get to 2 goals here. The first is I want to, with one change, make as much of a difference for the archetype as I can. And I think this is that change. And the second is I want to make X23 feel a little bit more like a Wolverine. This does a lot for that. I've talked a little bit about Thanos already. I don't necessarily think he's wildly overpowered or anything like that. And in fact, my instinct is I'd be happier to have more 5-drops like Thanos than I would to have Thanos be weaker. So in service of that, it seems to me like there is absolutely a 5-drop that could get a buff that is asking a lot of things from you in deck building and needs to be better in terms of the payoff. And that 5-drop is Cersei. So I've made her a 5/9. I think think it's a lot safer to buff Cersei compared to Annihilus, even though they typically go in similar decks, because Cersei does not clog your opponent and typically has a little more variance in her outcomes, which I do personally enjoy from a game design perspective. I am a bit of a fan of variance in outcomes. That said, I also think that there are a lot of 5-cost cards that they could be adding power to in the wake of Thanos' Fractured Frontier. And personally, that would be my preferred solution to the card. I don't know if they're going to take that direction, but if they just make more 5s and buff some 5s, I don't really think he's that big of an outlier. Right now, he's an outlier because he's the first good 5-drop they've ever made. Now, that's true, but that doesn't always have to be true. I know people are going to be like Sholau and Star-Lord. They don't exist anymore, and those are combo cards. That doesn't count. This is a very solid card, I think, at 5/9. And I think that, like, largely my big question when setting up this Faux-TA was, what are some decks that have quests that need power? And quests here is just like, what is this deck trying to do? What is the standard objective here? Is it a little bit different from just putting efficient points on the board? And that was what I was looking to reward, was decks that are doing something a little bit different. Maybe they're playing different packages of cards, something that is going to increase the diversity of the metagame. And I thought Cersei archetype was a great place for that to go. The same goes for Cersei's fellow Eternal, Thena. And I think that this is another one where the big question for me is, what are we going to put power into intentionally? How do you increase diversity in a metagame by doing an OTA? And my answer was, you give these archetype-specific cards with quests basically written on them, right? Vulture's quest is Move Me. X-23's quest is Destroy Me. Cersei's quest is play some cards that I can evolve, right? Like Thena's quest, play 2 cards a turn. I think that's good to reward. I think cards that have these kind of quests on them are good for identity. They let you know what the archetype is doing. They tell you, it's sort of Jujutsu Kaisen thing here. You know how, like, you can tell people what you're going to do as a way of raising the power of the thing you're going to do? I think Marvel Snap should be a little bit like that, where if you're telling your opponent, this is what my strategy is, you should be rewarded with some power for that. And I think Thena is a card that has been well out of the way for a while and could use some power even in this context of decks that are probably going to be able to play a card like this. I also think that there are 2 buffs they could do here. I think I picked the right one, but I can see why people would prefer the other one. The other buff I had in mind was just changing her to say 2 or more. I think that gets her into more decks, but it really pushes against what I'm going for here, which is mechanical identity. And so while I do think I personally would be more excited to play with a 2/0 Thena that said 2 or more cards, I don't think that accomplishes my goals from a design perspective here. So it's one of those things where, like, player KM and designer, fake designer KM, faux designer KM are in conflict. I would much rather play with the other version of this, but I don't think I can honestly say it's accomplishing my goals. Rescue to 4/5 in large part to make her a viable thing for Thanos to copy with the Reality Stone in decks that are keying off of 10s. I am honestly appalled that Rescue doesn't already do this, but I do think that, hey, Thanos doing this should probably happen. This should probably be a thing that we let the new cool 5-drop do in the Scar deck. And I realize people might be like, why would you want to buff the Scar deck? And it's like, I just sort of think, again, we're looking at decks with identity. We're trying to think about what I like about Marvel Snap. What do I love about Marvel Snap? Archetype, diversity, identity. These are strong things for the game if you can get to them. And I think that the biggest objection to Thanos, to me, is not that he's overpowered, but that he's over ubiquitous and that he crushes that identity. And I think you could argue that despite the fact that Thanos has like 5 decks under his own umbrella, they're all still Thanos decks, and you still see that little gun thing go off every time, and you're like, oh, another Thanos net decker. Oh, I'm sensitive to that. My instinct is largely, though, that it's twofold. It's not just Thanos, it's that there's a bunch of other stuff that isn't particularly good enough. And Thanos can be a beneficiary of this. He can make decks a little bit stronger and make these archetypal things. Like Thanos in a deck that's trying to use him to clone Rescue is very different than Thanos in a Batroc deck. That's completely, absolutely different. And so I'm hoping that that is something that will not be lost on people. And, maybe this would actually work. Very real chance people are just like, oh man, why'd you even bother nerfing Thanos then? You just made him better. Like I'm conscious of that too. But again, what I'm aiming at here is just the Tens deck is an archetype with some pretty strong identity, and I would like to make it a little bit stronger. Last up, Darkhawk to 4-0. I almost went all the way back to Darkhawk's original 4-1 stat line here. But basically, again, we talk about identity. And I realize the Darkhawk deck is not a particularly safe deck to buff if you're thinking about this from the perspective of, does this make Marvel Snap more fun? I totally understand why they don't necessarily want to improve the deck that's all about doing something that sucks. But I think that Darkhawk at 4 was an interesting game piece. The additional synergy with things like Ravonna Renslayer and Mystique, because getting it out earlier or getting it out after being discounted allows you to do things like final turn Darkhawk Mystique, which we now no longer have access to. That kind of stuff is very cool, very interesting. And Darkhawk, I think, ultimately does just play as a fair deck. It's a fair deck, and I think this is the other thing. The big thing I'm aiming at is using these changes in this Faux-TA to bring other cards with them, right? I don't want people to just play X23 in whatever. I want the X23 buff to make people play more Destroy. And Darkhawk is one of the most dialed in, you play this with some cards that you never play otherwise packages in the entire game. And I consider that upside. And I think that, maybe you could argue what you're supposed to do here is actually do this with Devil Dinosaur. I think Devil Dinosaur is a little bit riskier, in part because of the prevalence of Thanos and various double Thanos decks, and the general prevalence and consistency of V-Hand decks in previous metagames, the existence of Gambit. I think that largely I'm more concerned with giving this buff to Devil Dino than I would be with Darkhawk, even though Darkhawk is not necessarily a wonderful deck to have around. It is ultimately a deck that does play fair. And it is also a deck that has a pretty clearly core-defined identity that I'd be excited to see again. I don't think I've seen this card in 2 years, not in any real numbers at least. This guy does not exist, and I think maybe he should. All right, y'all, I hope you enjoyed the Faux-TA. I hope my ethos came through this time. I hope you guys were able to understand exactly what I was going for and the places in which player KM and Faux-TA designer KM were in conflict. As always, these are just my opinions. I do this as a purely theoretical exercise. These opinions in no way represent Second Dinner. Thank you so much. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal, and I'll see you in the next one.